Hi.
It's great to see you as always.
So good to see you.
So here we are. We're not in the Naperville bookstore. We're down in the bowels of the Tivoli Theater.
Yes.
Which I thought would be so perfect for your new book, The Marvels.
Yeah, it's great. It's beautiful theater.
It is. You know, and this book seems to be like your most personal yet of anything you've done. So tell us a little about where the seeds came for The Marvels, because this is all about a family and of actors.
Yeah.
It starts, this goes over like 150-year period.
Yeah.
And that's just the illustrations alone of the book, and then you had a lot of other things there.
Yeah.
Tell us where the seed for this started to go, where the little,
It started with my love of the theater and with my love of this strange little museum in London called the Dennis Seaver's House. And so I had been an actor in high school and college, and I designed sets, and I've always really loved the theater. And I've always included theatrical elements in my books. Even I realized, like, my first book, The Houdini Box in 1991, the very first drawing is closed curtains that when you turn the page, they open.
Yes, right.
And so there's always been curtains that open, and thinking about, what happens when you turn the page is like opening a door or like the opening of a curtain.
Well, and when Marion sang,
it's all at the Metropolitan Opera. So the stage and my love of the stage has been very important, but I've never actually made a book about actors specifically. And so I thought, what if I told the story of, a multi-generational family like the Barrymores or the Redgraves, and trace this single family, like you said, from 1766 to 1900, and then tell that story entirely in pictures, and then jump to 1990 where there's a second story all in text. And that story is the one that's inspired by the Dennis Seaver's House, which is this house in London that's kept as if it's still the 18th and 19th centuries. And so you walk in, and the idea is that the family's just stepped out. So there's hot food on the table, and there's food cooking in the kitchen, and there's laundry in the corner, and it's very chilling.
It's like Time Machine.
Yeah, it's a real time machine that
really literally has stepped into.
Yeah, and so it's a very uncanny experience. And so I used my experiences in the house, as well as my friendship with David Milne, who is the curator of the house, as inspiration for the second half of the book. And then all these themes that had started with Hugo in terms of family and storytelling and love, like they feel like they sort of culminated with the Marvels.
Yeah, and this book has so many emotional elements to it. I mean, there's loss, there's just all sorts of things that happen within the story, and I think those are themes that are pretty prevalent in your other two. I don't even know what to call this genre. I think we have to create a new genre for you. I don't know if you've come up with one yet, but I just want to call it epic novel with many illustrations.
Really long picture books.
No, really long picture books. But when you set out to tell the story, and you have almost 400 pages of illustrations to tell this story, no words except maybe the words you might see on a playbill, or you might see on a note or a letter or something like that. How do you start to set up? Are you thinking in your head, being an artist, are you thinking in image or word when you start to tell a story?
I almost always think in pictures, but I don't draw first. I always write first. So I see things, write down what I see, and then it's only after I have a version of the narrative begun that I go back and start drawing pictures that will tell that narrative. So it's a somewhat backwards process, but the drawings tend to come a little bit easier, so I think I put them off till a little bit later. And then the story always changes once I'm actually doing the little sketches and working out what the specific pictures are going to be, because sometimes I'll think, even though I think in pictures, I will think about something that a character loves, and that's not something that's always illustrative. Sometimes to get across certain ideas, you have to figure out other ways of telling the story. So the narrative will shift and change, but it begins with words, then little sketches, and then once I know specifically what I'm going to draw, what angles, what people, what time periods, then I'll start doing more specific research and photographing models and traveling to the places where the story is set to take pictures.
And you did travel. You've been to London many times before.
Yes.
But you spent a good amount of time, right?
Yeah,
Piccadilly
Piccadilly Circus. I lived there
Yeah.
for 3 months.
Oh, what was that like? And what was
It
your flat like?
it was like living in Times Square. Like it
Oh.
never got dark and it never got quiet.
Oh, wow.
The neon lights were right outside my windows. People were always screaming in packs outside on the street, drunk all the time. But I was right in the middle of the theater district, and so I was able to get very easily to all of the theaters. The Royal Haymarket, which was one of the main inspirations for the theaters, was right down the street. And my flat was a little studio apartment up on the 4th floor of this building that had been around since probably was built in the early 1800s. And it was great. I found it online, but it turned out when I got there, the guy who was renting it had missed his flight, so we overlapped for a little bit, and it turned out he was the former director of the Royal Opera, and so I was telling him about my project, and he recommended some things for me to do and movies to watch. So there were a lot of nice serendipitous things that happened that helped me along the way, but it was great being in London for that amount of time.
So research. So if he was the Royal Opera, then you have a lot of backstage scenes.
Yeah.
Stuff that's happening backstage. So did you do a lot of research like that, or even you're 150 years? So
Yes.
For your illustration, there's a lot of detail.
Yes.
That goes in that. So what kind of research did you do?
A lot of research
Yeah.
that
Right.
before I left for London, I did a lot of reconnaissance and set up tours for myself at about 5 different theaters in London. You just start telling people what you're doing, and then someone might say, oh, my friend's brother runs this theater in London, and suddenly you're emailing with them, and you're in the basement of that theater in the dressing rooms, and then I became friendly with the woman whose father owns the Royal Haymarket, and so I had full access to that theater anytime I wanted, and so I would call her up and say, I need a picture of the dressing rooms today, or I need something behind the scenes or up in the gallery. And so that was really helpful. And then just traveling around London, I would see interesting things like statues of dragons that would appear all over London that I eventually found out were boundary markers for the old city of London that I then put into the book. And so just living in London filled me with ideas for things to put into the book.
So Brian, how long did the book take you from inception to all the illustrations and writing the text? Because it's so cool. You have that almost 400 pages of illustrations. Then
Yeah.
you have the text, and then you go
Yeah.
back to illustration, which
Yeah.
makes such beautiful bookends.
Oh, good.
For this. But how long? Because I can't imagine.
It takes about 3 years to make these books, and then another 6 to 9 months of design work and making all the decisions about the binding and the paper and the case cover. That if you take the book jacket off, the case cover is a little bit different, and then getting Scholastic to agree to do the gold edges on the book, which I think looks really nice, and they were excited about doing it.
Oh no, it's gorgeous. It is
Yeah.
the most beautiful book just from the outside.
Oh, good.
The end papers, everything.
Yeah.
Even the display it came in had the theater.
Yeah, with the toy theater in it.
With it was so cool.
Yeah, Scholastic really cares about all of those details.
Right.
And so when I call them up and say, hey, I had this idea, or I saw a 19th century book that had these beautiful gold edges and a gold stamped cover, can we do something like that? Scholastic was very quick to say, yes, let's do it. And so you can imagine what it's like, and you're excited when they say yes, but then when you actually get the book, and it's then in your hands, and it's got the fancy gold edges. So I'm on tour right now, and I spoke in a church the other night, and I had this up on the pew and the altar with me, and it really looked like I had my big giant secular Bible with me, and it's just so nice to finally see it all finished.
Well, what's so great about the 3 books that you've done in this form, they all look great on a shelf.
Oh yes.
I know. That's so cool.
Yeah, they're
all 3 of them look together.
the eye, because when the Hugo, when I did the cover for the invention of Hugo Cabret, it was the first cover that I had ever done that didn't have a person on it.
Right.
And because I like drawing people, but I knew that was the right cover, and I liked it. But so then I thought, well, what if I put someone on the spine, and then I could wrap him around? And so that was how I got the idea. And then for Wonderstruck, I put Rose on the cover, and then for the Marvels,
But
Joseph.
They look really cool.
But they, yeah, all lined up.
They really do, which
Yeah.
I thought was such a cool one. So you went to the Rhode Island School of Design.
Yes.
And you intended to go into like theater.
Yes.
Stage design and
Yes.
all that. So tell us the precipitous journey, which we're so glad you took, and it had to do with a bookstore in New York.
Yeah.
A bookstore called Eeyore.
Yes.
So we want to know and I want to know how you felt about children's books.
Yes.
Before all of this began for you.
Well, I was told in high school that I should be a children's book illustrator by most of the adults in my life, which made me not want to be a children's book illustrator because I didn't want to listen to any of the adults in my life. So I didn't take any classes with any children's book illustrators at RISD. I didn't study with Chris Van Allsburg or David Macaulay, who taught there. I didn't go hear Maurice Sendak speak. And I got really into the theater, and I did a lot of theater at Brown University and decided I was going to be a set designer. And yeah, and it wasn't until after college where I was really trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I realized, I wanted to do something that I really loved, and I love drawing, I love writing, and I've always loved kids.
Yeah.
And I finally realized, oh my gosh, I think I'm supposed to be a children's book illustrator. But I didn't study it in school at all, so I didn't know anything about it. So a friend of mine suggested that I get a job at Eeyore's Books for Children in New York, a good, amazing, independent children's bookstore. And it's really where I learned all about children's books. I learned about the importance of independent bookstores for a community and what they mean to a community like Anderson's, how important it is to have that as a hub for families and for people to come together. And the children's bookstores, I think, that are surviving, like Anderson's, are the ones that have made themselves a really important hub in the community, because you can't get that anywhere else. And so my whole life was changed by my time at Eeyore's. I read all the books in the store. I met all the kids. My boss, Steve Geck, who's amazing, who you know. He's now an editor at Source Books, but at the time he was the manager at Eeyore's, and I showed him this little story I was working on because I respected his opinion, and he grew up in a children's bookstore in Minnesota. And he really liked my book and said, oh, my girlfriend is the Manhattan sales rep for Random House. Would you like me to show it to her? And I said, sure, that'd be great. Because in the meantime, I had sent it out to about 5 or 6 other editors, including Arthur Levine, who went on to publish the Harry Potter books, of course. And Diana Blau, his girlfriend, now wife, sent it to Ann Schwartz, who was at Knopf at the time, and she published it. And the book came out while I was a bookseller at Eeyore's. So
how cool is that?
It was very fun to be a bookseller with a book.
Yeah, but all that theater set design that you wanted to do, you did great windows at Eeyore's.
Thank you.
Pictures of those
windows.
windows.
Yeah, I used to paint the windows for the different holidays. We had, I think the first one I did was for Anthony Brown, the illustrator of Gorilla, was coming to our store. And I said, oh, I'm an artist, I'll do the window. And I couldn't find a piece of paper big enough because I wanted to make a giant gorilla. So I just thought, oh, well, what if I paint directly on the glass? And so by painting on the glass, it has to look good up close, it has to look good from the inside and from the outside and from across the street. And so I put did the painting directly on the glass, and then I ended up doing windows at the store for the next 2 years while I was working there, and learned a lot about book covers because that's what you have to do. It has to look good up close, it has to look good far away, it has to draw your eye. And of course now book covers also have to look good this big for online images, but it's about drawing people in. And so I really learned that from doing the windows at Eeyore's.
Well, the theater's lost our game. Okay, all right. So tonight, while you're signing books, we're going to play the movie, Hugo,
great.
Which is really cool. So I want to know what it was like working with Martin Scorsese. And I know you didn't do the script, but you are working on a script.
Yes.
Wonderstruck, so I want to hear about that. But what was it like working with him? And then also to do that little cameo at the end, which is so cool. Yeah,
I was in a very lucky position in that Scorsese really loved my book, and I was there just as a fan. John Logan wrote the screenplay, Dante Freddi designed the sets, won an Oscar for it, Cindy Powell did the costumes. and everybody was told by Scorsese to follow my book as closely as possible. So by the time I came to the set, I was able to just look and be overwhelmed by the beauty of it and the excitement of it. And I did end up with a cameo. I was given a line in the last scene of the movie. And so I found myself in costume, surrounded by people who I either made up or had researched very heavily and then created my own versions of.
You're in the book yourself.
Yeah, but there's Martin Scorsese directing, telling stories about when he was shooting the tracking shot for Goodfellas, on the set. So, because it was the same camera operator, Larry McConkey, who filmed the Copacabana tracking shot, who was filming the tracking shot for Hugo. So it was really weird and amazing and fun, really, really fun. I got to go to the Oscars, and I had a lot of amazing experiences. But the most amazing thing and the most surprising thing to me was that I ended up becoming friends with a lot of people on the set. And I became really good friends with John Logan, and he ended up helping me write my own screenplay. So he said very clearly he wanted to just give me notes, and it would be my screenplay. And so with his help, I wrote a screenplay for Wonderstruck, and now it's going to be directed by Todd Haynes, who I've been a huge fan of. He did Far From Heaven, and his new movie Carol is opening in November with Cate Blanchett. And Sandy Powell did the costumes, and it was Sandy, who I also became friends with, who blinged out my wrist guard, by the way.
I was going to ask you about that.
I have a slight...
That's bedazzled.
Yeah, I have a slight repetitive stress injury.
I can understand why.
And Sandy said, you need some Swarovski crystals. I was in London with her visiting and on tour, so she did this to me.
That's great.
And so Sandy brought the screenplay to Todd, and he said yes.
Wow. So when is it going into production?
It looks like we're going to go into production in January, and then we'll film in the spring and summer, very soon.
So how different was it writing a screenplay compared to your other writing? And also too, and even for Hugo, you're thinking in imagery.
Yes.
As you're illustrating, but then seeing your imagery interpreted by someone else.
Right.
So it must have been just a surreal sort of experience.
Yeah.
But now that you've written the script, now you have a little bit more control, maybe.
Well, there's a certain kind of control, but ultimately it is a director's medium. And so seeing my story through Martin Scorsese's eyes was astonishing. And the thought of getting to see Wonderstruck through Todd's eyes is really thrilling. And really, in a way, it was easier to write the screenplay because I wasn't inventing a story. When I'm writing a book, I'm also creating the entire story. So everything is coming from scratch. And so that's why it takes 3 years. But I was able to write the screenplay, especially with John Logan's amazing notes, in about 6 or 7 months, because it was mostly about reduction and about condensing the story that in the book might take place over 5 nights into 1 night, taking 4 different clues and reducing them to a single clue, but then figuring out what the visual language is for these 2 stories. And I think I ended up coming up with something that is going to be fun to see.
This book, I think Joseph is such a great character in this book. And just wondering, the bits and pieces of him, are they a bit you? Are they a bit of somebody you know? Because I think it's his part of the story that starts in 1990 that we actually go through everything, that really, I think we get an insight into. And there's so many wonderful characters in this book. But his character was absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, oh, thank you. Yeah, no, there's a lot of me in all of the characters that I write about, who I create, and there's definitely a lot of me in Joseph, but Joseph's also very closely inspired by David Milne, the curator at the Dennis Seavers house. So there's specifics to Joseph's story about his love of fire and elements about how he grew up in the Middle East for a little while that come directly from David, but how they get woven together and how they make Joseph into the person who Joseph is, because Joseph ultimately is a different person than David Milne. It's sort of like some elements of David Milne filtered through me and into this person who then feels real on the page.
And we don't want to do any spoilers, but there's a great twist in the mysteries in this, so we won't say.
All right, no spoilers.
Okay, so Rob, what are you working on now? Very, very quickly.
I'm on tour for another month or so, and I have an idea for a new book, although I'm not really working on it quite yet. I've written a little bit, starting to do some research. The movie is going to be going into production, so I'll be working on that a little bit. I'm writing a musical of my first book, The Houdini Box, and so that's been really fun to work on. I'm writing the book and collaborating with a really great lyricist and a really great composer. So that's been fun, and a few other interesting projects. So yeah, keeping me busy.
Yeah, you are. Well, thank you so much, Brian, and we can't wait for tonight to see
Thank
the
you.
presentation. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. So good to talk.
All right.